a man who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Coffee, 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 coffee. That sounds crazy, but that's kind of how I look at the world. I like to look at the world through the bottom of a coffee cup, as opposed to the bottom of a bottle of booze. No one ever got in trouble for drinking too much coffee. To get the best coffee in the universe, you need to go to Organic Man Coffee Trike, 4501 McPherson. That's if you're here in Laredo. If you're not in Laredo, you can go to organicmancoffeetrike.shop. If you can't get from there to here, go online. That's the new way of doing things. I was listening to Paranormal Rundown. Vic Hermanson was talking about a patient that he was treating one day that kept saying there was someone else in the room. Someone Vic couldn't see. This patient may have been crazy, but even crazy folks get sick or injured once in a while, and a good nurse will take care of them. Vic told the patient that he could not see or hear what this other person was saying, and so they were going to have to relay everything. When dealing with crazy people, never pretend like you can hear or see what they can hear and see. Both will get you unwanted responses. Buying into a crazy person's delusions is dangerous. Crazy is defined as very foolish, senseless, or strange, extremely excited, enthusiastic, wildly irrational, or incoherent. Here in Laredo, we have more than our fair share of crazy people. I probably offended someone with that. Don't call them crazy. They might be offended. That's mean to say crazy. In the 1500s, the word crazy meant to be sickly or infirm. A century later, crazy was used to mean insane or demented. To me, the word police are all crazy. Politically correct means oppression from the government. The First Amendment of the United States Constitution prevents Congress from making laws respective to the establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Any of y'all remember the Black Plague of 2020? Or abridging the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the freedom of assembly, as long as it's not violent, or the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. I see nothing that says that you can't call a person crazy. There's nothing that says you have the right not to be offended. Common sense is what should guide us on what to say or not say. If I see some guy eating roadkill on the side of the road, or maybe even sitting at a table, that is crazy. It would also be crazy for me to say so to that person. Darn cat. Anyone crazy enough to eat things found on the ground is probably crazy enough to try to kill me. Common sense is in short supply these days. What is crazy and what is something else? At what point does a person's actions step over the line? I've done some things that others consider to be crazy. I'm fairly certain I am not crazy, but then crazy people don't know they're crazy. My wife probably thinks I'm crazy. I know a few guys at work that figured I'd stepped over the line. The trick is to be sure to step back. On the bike patrol, we tended to do things to try to impress each other while at the same time risking life and limb. There used to be a staircase that ran next to the bridge. It ran down to the parking lot with a bend in the middle. It was about 30 feet down. Not long down. The trick was to slow down just before you hit that turn so you wouldn't go over the handrail. Yes, I rode down those stairs. No, I did not kill myself. Most people watching us must have thought, those boys are crazy. Seth Alvo does things on a bike that I think are crazy. He has a channel called Berm Peak. He's also 27 years younger than me. It's worth watching him do some of the crazy stunts he does on a bike. The nice thing is, he'll also show you how to fix your bike once you've messed things up. Is he crazy? To me, not that crazy. To my wife, he needs help. Seth knows he is doing crazy things, but he enjoys doing them and he is good at it. He's not crazy, he just does crazy things. I started to say that here in Laredo we have more than our fair share of crazy folks. While up visiting San Antonio, I asked a couple of police officers about this. They told me to not quote them, but it was policy. If anyone of a less than balanced nature was found living in the great outdoors, an urban outdoorsman, as it were, the crazy person was escorted to the bus station, given a one-way ticket south. The city that is straight south from San Antonio just happens to be Laredo. On the bike patrol, we were right there close to everyone, and no vehicle to separate us from them. In a unit, you have the doors with windows that kind of isolate you from everyone else. On a bike, you are present and easy to talk to. I met a lot of crazy folks while on the bike patrol. William thought he was a woman. He dressed the part, using whatever he could find at some of the local used clothing warehouses. It's amazing how much they throw away every day. He would go through their trash and pick out the parts that he liked. If you want to dress like a woman, at least shave. William usually had a few days' growth on his face. His wig came from an old mannequin, like from the 60s, and it was blonde, and he wasn't. He would sit in Jarvis Plaza and he would play an acoustic guitar that had a speaker duct taped to it. He couldn't play music as far as anyone could tell. He didn't have a singing voice either, but then he didn't really know the words to any of the songs or the sounds that he was making. The thing is, he seemed to be quite happy being who he was. He told us about his accomplishments around town and how he was working his way up. He did sleep on the front steps of the courthouse, but he was never a problem as far as us or the police were concerned. He was never in any fights. He didn't drink or do drugs. It was just that his elevator didn't reach the top floors. He never told us about having any family anywhere. There must have been someone somewhere out there wondering whatever happened to their son or their brother or that member of the family. Did he wander off one day after forgetting to take his medication? Was he placed in some facility somewhere because the family got tired of his antics? Did he get released because some judge decided he was not a threat to himself or others? We don't know. You could ask him all kinds of questions, and he would only answer the ones that he wanted to. He wasn't all that old. He was only about maybe 30 at the most. Once I was moved to another detail, I lost track of most of the interesting people. They all tended to stay close to the Jarvis Plaza area. You might could say Jarvis Plaza was a magnet for interesting folks. Was William really convinced that he had two X's and not an XY? Did he look in the mirror and not see the same image that the rest of us saw? Was he really convinced that he was a woman? Or did he want it so badly that he was blocking out all of the guy stuff? He was crazy, but he wasn't a problem. If I had to live in a world with folks like him around, well, it wouldn't be that bad. It would just be a little weird. Not like some of the others that we had to deal with. On the other hand, if I were surrounded by guys like, oh, say, Elisha Rivas, things could have been way too interesting. Elisha Marcus Rivas was born in 1827. After graduating from an Illinois teachers college, he taught school briefly in Illinois. Not finding his place in life, Rivas moved to California where he taught school at El Monte. He soon lost interest in teaching and decided to try his hand at gold prospecting. He spent most of the 1850s looking for gold, and he joined a group of adventurers and prospectors headed for the Bradshaw Mountains in the Arizona Territory, 1863. Rivas had little success in the Bradshaws, and he returned to California in 66. He married Mary Sexton December 30th, 1867, in San Gabriel. They had two children. The daughter was named Louisa Marie. The son didn't last very long. Rivas returned to Arizona Territory in the fall of 69. His uncle Isham had just been appointed Assistant Chief Justice of the Territorial Supreme Court. Rivas traveled to La Paz with Isham, but separated and traveled on alone to Vulture City. He spent enough time in Vulture City to appear on the U.S. Census report August 20th, 1870. His name then appears in Fort McDowell area. It is believed that Rivas settled on a horse ranch north of town in Verde River, where he trained horses. He may have ridden with the Army as a civilian between 1870 and 72. He knew the area around the Superstition Mountains quite well from his time with the military. He was familiar with the valleys there, and one of them was eventually named for him, Rivas Valley. Some say that he served as a deputy marshal in McDowell, having been appointed by his uncle. Just a little bit of nepotism there. 1875 and 1880 census report showed Elisha still living in Fort McDowell. At this time, he was living in the Superstition Mountains but traveling back and forth. Maybe he only filed his home as being Fort McDowell, but he had a cabin in the Superstitions. The Apache considered the Superstition Mountains as sacred. That's how they got their name. This was where the spirits lived. Anyone desecrating the land would wind up minus one head. Back when Peralta first began mining the gold, many of his men wound up sin cabeza, headless. How was it that Revis could live on the mountain without becoming a dead guy? To begin with, he was a very good marksman. He carried an 1886 38-40 as well as two Colt 45s. The Apache did consider him an interloper, and they decided to do something about it. Armed to the teeth, they set out to remove Revis. During their first attempt, 3 warriors were killed. The Indians pull back to regroup, wait for Revis to either run out of ammunition, food, or water. Revis wasn't into waiting, so he removed all of his clothes. He stripped down to his nakedness. He grabbed a butcher knife in each hand and he attacked. Picture this: Sicily, 1932. No, Superstition Mountain, 1878. You're camping with a bunch of fellow warriors when out of the dark comes a naked white guy screaming at the top of his lungs and brandishing 2 knives. He ran into the camp and the Indians all ran out. The Apache were convinced that Revis was insane. They decided it was best to leave him alone. From that night on, Revis was known as the White Devil. Any time the tribe was in the area, they made sure to give Revis a wide berth. Crazy people were believed to have supernatural powers. Revis, charging into the camp the way he did, convinced the Apache that he was not human, more than human. Some say this was just a ploy by Revis to keep the Apache away. Others believe he was truly crazy. At night, he was seen running around the mountain naked, shooting at the sky, trying to shoot out the moon. Revis was a well read man. He'd been a schoolteacher, after all. He knew a lot about the world. He also liked to be alone. He grew his own food, hunted for meat, and once in a while he would ride into town to visit. By 1895, Revis was almost 70 years old. His health created a few concerns among his friends. James Dalabo often checked in on Revis, and Revis told him that he was fixin' to ride into town for supplies. When Dalabo heard that Revis hadn't arrived in town, he returned to the mountains to check on him. Dalabo found the remains of the old hermit just off the Rogers Canyon in what is now known as Grave Canyon. Was Revis really crazy or just eccentric? The crazy act did keep the Apache away, but was it an act or did Revis have some issues upstairs? He did like to run around naked at night in the mountains where there were snakes and coyotes and mountain lions and other hungry beasts hunting. Does that make him crazy or just is he living life to its fullest? So running around naked, I don't know, it sounds kind of attractive, but not in Laredo. You get sunburned all over. Diogenes was born in 403 BC in Sinope, uh, in Paphlagonia on the Black Sea. He was the son of Hicesius, who was a money changer authorized to exchange foreign currency for local cash. As a child, Diogenes learned to read, write, quote both epic and tragic verses, while also being trained in athletics and horsemanship. His dad had cash, so he didn't have to learn a trade. Once he was old enough to work, if that's what you want to call it, Diogenes he became an epimeletus, which is a magistrate who, depending on where you were in the world, that was what you did for a living. You were paid to do something in the government. His father was accused of defacing coins. He would take foreign coins and restamp them to make them worth more money. This led to the old man being thrown into prison, and Diogenes was exiled. Depending on who you listen to, it may have been Diogenes who had done the dirty deed, and his dad just took the fall for it. Once he said that he had asked Apollo's oracle in Delphi how he could gain renown. The oracle replied, "Adulterate the currency," which he took to mean that he should counterfeit coins. The exact date of Diogenes' departure from Sinope is uncertain. It is also uncertain whether he was banished or exiled, or if he simply fled in order to avoid prison time. Diogenes' exile marked a turning point and the moment of profound spiritual conversion. In his time, being separated from one's homeland and thus denied the honor of being buried with one's ancestors was seen as a tragic fate. Diogenes rejected this sentiment, embracing exile as the ultimate detachment from worldly ties. Plutarch said the hardship of exile transformed Diogenes into a philosopher. The noble exiles like Odysseus and Heracles, about whom Diogenes wrote, served as models of exemplary behavior. Diogenes also claimed an encounter with a mouse revealed to him the value of a simple life, since the rodent is capable of adapting itself to just about any circumstance. Diogenes, now keep in mind he's a homeless exile, owned a slave named Manus. Since Diogenes was now living in poverty after fleeing Sinope, Manus must have been a part of his earlier life rather than a slave bought once he arrived in Athens. When the slave decided he'd had enough and left, Diogenes dismissed his ill fortune by saying, "If Manus can live without Diogenes, why not Diogenes without Manus?" True freedom comes from detaching oneself from possessions and desires. So even owning a slave could be seen as a form of a self-enslavement. Diogenes spent his winters in Athens taking shelter in a jar, a pithos, which must have been large enough to at least fit his body. Look at the folks pushing shopping carts around town and picture them living in huge cardboard boxes. Kind of the same thing, except cardboard hadn't been invented yet. When the weather got too cold, he would move to a better climate. Diogenes' life was marked by radical self sufficiency, passivity to fate, and an indifference to suffering. He went barefoot and used his tunic as his bedding. He openly engaged in behavior that defied social norms, such as fondling himself in public to the extreme, spitting or even urinating on people. He supported himself by begging, which he saw as fair compensation for his role in challenging society's values. I've seen some homeless guys that act like that. The Athenians held this man in high regard, even replacing his jar whenever it got broken. One day he discarded his drinking cup after watching a boy drink water using just his hands. Diogenes said he had no idea that you could do it this way until he'd seen someone else do it. He was also known to wander the marketplace by day holding up a lit lamp. He would tell people he was looking for a man. In his later years, he carried a walking stick when he left town, a symbol of both his itinerant lifestyle and public authority. Ancient texts report that he visited various other cities, which helped shape his reputation as a wandering philosopher. He admired Sparta, yet he employed his trademark method of teaching through criticism while there. When a Spartan cited Hesiod's, Hesiod's verse, "Nor would the ox die if the neighbor were not evil," Diogenes retorted, "But the Messenians and their oxen have died, and you are their neighbors." Diogenes' other travels remain mysterious. He visited various cities in Asia Minor, especially Miletus, known for its rich intellectual history. He may have journeyed for philosophical reasons, though the exact details are lost. Nobody ever bothered to write down most of that, or if they did write it down, it's lost to time. While on a voyage to Aegina, he was captured by pirates. Diogenes was sold at a slave market. As he stood there surveying the crowd, he told the auctioneer that he needed to sell him to a man standing in the crowd because that man needs a good master. Zeniotis bought Diogenes and turned him into a teacher and an overseer. Diogenes did such a good job that he was eventually set free. Instead of returning to Athens, he stayed on in the street near a gymnasium that was named the Cranium on the outskirts of town overlooking the harbor. According to Diogenes, no, according to Dionysius the Stoic, Diogenes was taken prisoner in 338 by Philip II of Macedonia during the Battle of Coriona. Amused by the audacity of the captive, Philip decided to release him. July 336, Diogenes attended the 111th Olympic Games. When a herald announced that this man has defeated that man, Diogenes yelled, "On the contrary, he only defeats slaves while I defeat men." When asked if he had come to compete, Diogenes replied that he was there to take part in combat of human ills, anger, mistrust, sadness, desire, and fear. At the Isthmus Games, he crowned himself victor by placing a pine wreath on his own head. This kind of pissed off the Corinthians, who promptly removed it. Diogenes met Philip's son, Alexander the Great, in 336 when Alexander was proclaimed commander of the expedition against the Persians at the Isthmus of Corinth. Plutarch said, when Alexander arrived, Diogenes refused to join the formal greeting, and instead he stayed in his usual spot in the cypress grove outside. Alexander engaged him in conversation that later became quite famous. At the approach of the king and his staff, Diogenes sat up a little and fixed his eyes on Alexander. When the king greeted him and asked if there was anything he wanted, Diogenes replied, "Yes, you should stand a little farther away, out of my sun." Alexander was so impressed by this and the arrogance and the grandeur of a man that could treat him with such disdain that he told his followers, "I tell you this, if I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes." Would Alexander the Great have a southern accent? Well, he was from southern Greece. Some sources claim that Diogenes died June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, the same night that Alexander the Great died. The exact location of his death remains disputed, kind of like how they lost Alexander's body. In ancient Greece and Rome, a philosopher's death was often seen as a final statement on their teachings. Diogenes' death, with its imaginative and various accounts, became as controversial as his indifference to his own burial. Tellus said in tribute to Diogenes, "What difference is there between being consumed by fire, devoured by dogs, left above ground to be preyed upon by vultures, or buried below ground to be eaten by worms?" A bronze statue of Diogenes was erected in Sinope after his death, with a poem from Philiscus of Igenia at the base. The poem says, "Even bronze is aged by time, but not all the ages. Diogenes will destroy your fame, since you alone showed mortal the rule of self-sufficiency and the easiest path through life." They used to speak really weird back then. Now, was Diogenes crazy or just colorful? I've met some folks who lived life to the same way, moving about with little to nothing, yet garnering the respect of those they met. I've also run into a few who looked as if they had everything except brains. They didn't have things, their things had them. He who dies with the most wins. Really, who is crazy? The old guy living out in a field somewhere in a camper or a little cabin and driving an old used pickup and having all of his bills paid and not owing anyone anything? Or the guy living in the big mansion who owns so much money to everyone that he has to work 50, 60, 70 hours a week just to pay for all the toys that he can't even play with because he doesn't have any time? I still don't speak French, so as I butcher the language, just remember those ancestors that I thought I had from France actually came from Germany. Ferrare was born near Lyon around 1772. His exact date of birth was unrecorded, and it's not even known if Terrari was his real name or just his nickname. As a child, he had a huge appetite, and by his teens, he could eat a quarter of a cow that weighed as much as he did in a single day. Let's just say he weighed about 80 pounds. Being a teenager in France in the 1700s, probably that's a bit much. Folks were a bit smaller back then, and the French were on a diet of cake. Well, that's what Marie Antoinette told them to eat. This would mean that he ate about 20 pounds of meat in a day. Terrari's folks couldn't afford an eating machine. They could barely feed themselves, so they sent him on a quest. Go look for the meaning of life, the universe, and, well, I believe it was more like get out and stay out. Terrari toured the country with a roaming band of thieves and prostitutes, stealing or begging food. At some point, he was taken on as a warm up act to a traveling charlatan, snake oil salesman kind of thing. Terrari would draw a crowd by eating corks, stones, live animals, uh, swallowing an entire basket of apples one at a time. He ate ravenously, and he was particularly fond of snakes. 1788, Terrari moved to Paris to work as a street performer. He was usually successful, but on a few occasions the act went wrong and he would wind up with severe intestinal obstructions. Members of the crowd had to carry him to the Hotel Dieu hospital, where he was treated with powerful laxatives. There she blows! I'll bet that was a fun job. Try to imagine who the poor character was that had to take care of him. He did make a full recovery, and he offered to demonstrate his act to the surgeon by eating his watch and chain. The surgeon said, nay, nay. Despite his unusual diet, Terrari was slim and of average height. At the age of 17, he weighed about 100 pounds. He was described as having unusually soft fair hair and an abnormally wide mouth. His teeth were heavily stained, and his lips were almost non existent. When he had not eaten, his skin hung so loosely that he could wrap the fold of skin from his abdomen around his waist. His body was hot to the touch, and he was always sweating. I worked with a guy like that named Victor? Yeah, Victor. Not Vic, but Victor. He was always sweating, even when it was cool out. Terrari had a foul aroma that hung over him, making anybody within 20 paces quite uncomfortable. Yeah, I worked with a few guys like that. The smell became noticeably worse after he ate. His eyes and cheeks would become bloodshot, and there was a visible vapor rose from his body. He would become lethargic, after which he would usually belch a lot, and his jaws would make chewing motions, kind of like a dog with distemper. My dog George had distemper, and it looks like he's always chewing gum now. They didn't have toilet paper at the time, and Terrari had chronic diarrhea, which probably only added to the smell. You had to use whatever you had at hand, and usually it was your hand after going to the bathroom. Talk about smell. I understand Paris was quite a smelly town. I understand it still is. Despite his large intake of food, he did not appear to vomit excessively or to gain weight. Aside from his eating habits, his contemporaries saw no apparent signs of mental illness or unusual behavior. The cause of Terrari's behavior is still not known. There are other documented cases of similar behavior. None of the subjects other than Terrari were autopsied, and there have been no modern documented cases resembling him. Hyperthyroidism can induce an extreme appetite, rapid weight loss, profuse sweating, heat intolerance, and fine hair. A damaged amygdala is known to induce polyphagia in animals, but not necessarily humans. In 1792, at the outbreak of the War of the First Coalition, Terrari joined the French army. I'll bet he fit right in with the rest of the folks. Military rations were insufficient to satisfy his appetite. He would carry out tasks for other soldiers in return for a share of their rations, and when that didn't give him enough food, he would scavenge in the garbage for scraps. This was still not enough to satisfy him. He was admitted to the military hospital at Salts-Sas ferrets. I know that's not how it's pronounced, but that's how it's spelled. Salts soused ferrets with a case of extreme exhaustion. He was granted quadruple rations, but remained hungry. He scavenged for garbage in gutters and in trash containers. He ate the scraps of food that were left by other patients, and he crept into the apothecary's room to eat the poultices. That would be the pharmacists and the medication. Military surgeons could not understand his appetite. Terrari was ordered to remain in the military hospital to take part in psychological experiments designed by Dr. Carvelle and Pierre Francis Percy, the surgeon in chief of the hospital. Carvelle and Percy decided to test Terrari's capacity for food. A meal had been prepared for 15 men that were working near the hospital. Generally, the hospital staff restrained Terrari whenever there was food around. But this time, Carvelli allowed him to reach the table undisturbed. Terrari ate the entire meal of 2 large meat pies, plates filled with grease and salt, and 4 gallons of milk. And then he fell asleep. Carvelli noted that Terrari's belly became distended like an inflated balloon. On another occasion, I need to cover my cat's ears, all 8 of them. I don't have 8 cats, I have 4 cats, but that means 8 ears. Terrari was presented with a live cat. He promptly tore the cat's abdomen open with his teeth, drank its blood, and ate the entire cat, aside from the bones. Then he vomited up the fur like a giant hairball. I say they should have put a bullet in the boy's head. No one should treat an animal like that, especially a cat. Following this, the hospital staff offered Terrari a variety of other animals, including snakes, lizards, and puppies. Now the hospital staff needs a bullet in the head, too. Who behaves like that? Well, Terrari ate everything that was given to him. He also swallowed an entire eel without chewing. He just crushed its head with his teeth and then slipped it down his throat. After several months spent as an experimental case, military authorities began to press for Terrari to be returned to active duty. Dr. Carvelli was keen to continue investigations into Terrari's eating habits and his digestive system. So he told General Alexander Boharnus that he had an idea that Terrari might make a good courier. They could send him behind the enemy lines and have him eat the enemy army. No, he was supposed to be a courier. The idea was they would give him a message inside a small wooden box, which he would swallow. If he was captured by the enemy, they would not find the box because it was inside his abdomen. A few days later, he would simply pass the box, and then they would have the note. So they set up a test. Carvelli showed Barhanus that Terrari could indeed swallow a box with a note in it. After a few days, he would poop it back out. Somebody would have the unpleasant duty to clean this little wooden box off and take out the message, which they could then read. Well, his first assignment was to carry a message to a French colonel that had been imprisoned by the Prussians near Neustadt. Terrari was told that the documents were of great military significance, but in reality, Baharnus had merely written a note asking the colonel to confirm that the message had been received successfully, and if so, that he should return a reply with any potential useful information about the Prussian troop movements. Terrari crossed Prussian lines under the cover of darkness, disguised as a German peasant. Unable to speak German, he soon attracted the attention of the locals, who alerted the Prussian authorities, and he was captured. A strip search found nothing suspicious on him, and despite being whipped by the Prussian soldiers, he refused to betray his mission. He was brought before the local Prussian commander, General Ziegler, who again he refused to talk about his secret mission. Well, they locked him up for 24 hours, and finally Terrari relented, probably because he was hungry, and he explained the scheme to his captors. They chained him to a latrine, and after 30 hours, he passed the wooden box. Zogli was furious when the documents, which Terrari had said contained vital intelligence, turned out to be only Baharness's dummy message. So Terrari was taken to the gallows, where he was going to be the guest of honor at a necktie party. The noose was placed around his neck, but then they decided not to kill him. Don't know why, they just did. I hope this was the true story, because the other story, which the fake message was never seen by the Prussians. Instead, the second story goes that Terrari did indeed pass the box through his bottom, but he immediately grabbed it, put it back in his mouth, and swallowed. Now that's just gone from being crazy to sick. Either way, Terrari was not hung. Instead, they gave him a thorough head to toe beating, and then they set him free near the French border. Just to prove that he wasn't indeed crazy, Terrari was desperate to avoid any further military service. So he went back to the hospital, telling Percy that he would attempt any possible cure for his overabundant appetite. Percy treated him with laudanum, a derivative of, I believe is it heroin or is it cocaine? Laudanum. Can't remember now. Anyway, they gave him laudanum. It was a liquid with a very potent drug suspended in it. They used to give it to kids for teething pain. Not only did it stop the pain, it stopped the breathing too. Well, the laudanum didn't work. They gave him wine and vinegar to drink. They gave him tobacco pills. None of this worked to turn off his appetite. When everything failed, Percy fed Terrari large quantities of soft boiled eggs, like in Cool Hand Luke. But this also failed to suppress his appetite. Luke Johnson ate 50 hard boiled eggs so he could win a bet. If you haven't seen the movie, well, it was cool. Paul Newman played Luke, and he didn't actually eat 50 hard boiled eggs, but it sure looked like he did. Efforts to keep Terrari on any kind of a controlled diet all failed. He would sneak out of the hospital to scavenge for guts outside of butcher shops and to fight stray dogs for rotting meat in the gutters, alleys, and rubbish heaps. He was also caught several times in the hospital drinking the blood from patients who were undergoing bloodletting. He would also attempt to eat bodies in the morgue. What did I say about him not being crazy? I think he was. Other doctors believed that Terrari was mentally ill, and they said that he should be transferred to a lunatic asylum. But Percy was keen to continue his experiments, and Terrari remained in the military hospital. A 14-month-old toddler disappeared from the hospital late one night. Terrari was immediately suspected of having consumed the child, due to his eating anything else. Percy was now unable or unwilling to defend him, and the hospital staff chased Terrari from the hospital, to which he never returned. In 1798, M. Tusser of the Versailles Hospital contacted Percy to notify him of a patient that wished to see him. Terrari was now bedridden and weak. He told Percy that he had swallowed a golden fork 2 years earlier, and he believed that it was now lodged inside his intestines, causing his current weakness. He hoped that Percy could find some way of removing it. Percy realized that what he actually had was the white plague, what we call tuberculosis today. A month later, Terrari began to experience extreme diarrhea, and then he died shortly after. The corpse immediately began to rot, which is really weird. The surgeons at the hospital refused to dissect it. Tessere wanted to find out how Terrari's intestines differed from those of normal folks. He was also curious as to whether that gold fork was in there somewhere. At the autopsy, Terrari's gullet was found to be abnormally wide, uh, the throat. And when his jaws were opened, surgeons could see all the way down into his stomach. He had a class 1 for intubation scale. Some of y'all will understand that. His body was found to be filled with pus, which is dead white blood cells. His liver and gallbladder were abnormally large, and his stomach was enormous, covered in ulcers, and it filled most of the abdominal cavity. There was no fork found inside anywhere. Was he crazy? I would say yes. Anyone willing to eat anything that had just passed through the exit point of anyone else or themselves has to be crazy. Anyone that would try to eat another person has to be crazy. What caused him to eat everything? Some kind of weird overdriving force was in control of his mind? Or was it just he had an overpowering urge to eat? And how was it he was able to burn off the calories so well? Way back when I lived in Seabrook, Texas, there was a young lady that lived in League City, but she would walk back and forth several times a day. You'd see her hitchhiking on 2094. She dressed like a teenager, a mini skirt, t-shirt that was way too tight, uh, some kind of tennis shoes. Her hair would be in braids, and sometimes she would be seen skipping along the side of the road as if she were having the time of her life. Other times you might see an old lady walking with a cane. She would wear a knee-length dress. Well, actually, it came down just below the knees, and clunky, shiny shoes. She would wear a pillbox hat with a veil on it and white gloves, something out of the 60s. Every once in a while, you'd see her dressed as if she were heading out on a really hot date somewhere with a fancy ball gown or a fancy dress, which kind of looked weird at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We called this young lady Sybil, as in the movie. A Sybil was a case of split personality, based on a true story. Well, it turned out that our Sybil had a lot of folks living in her head, but she didn't know any of them. One or two of them claimed that they didn't know her. Then there was the one who knew everything. This personality said that she was not homicidal, but that one of the others was a murderer. On occasion, we would see Sybil at the local steakhouse. She would saunter in and ask for a table for two. Once Seated, she would begin looking at the menu and carrying on a conversation, which on occasion would turn into an argument. If it got really heated, Sybil would storm out the door, demanding the other person pay for everything. The manager never got upset. It could be dangerous to confront this young lady. Instead, the manager had a phone number to call, which got her in contact with Sybil's folks. They would drive over and pay for the food and any damages. Sybil's real name was not Sybil. I'm not going to say it because certain laws against that sort of thing. She was actually 35 years old at the time, and she had two kids. Both of them were living with her parents because of a court order. One of the guys I worked with thought it would be fun to go out with a girl who was split personality like that. He said it would be like having a dozen girlfriends all at once. Well, he turned out to be sorry. She used the bathroom in the middle of his bed, number two. She messed the whole place up. She took food out of the refrigerator and smeared it all over the walls and the ceiling, and she wrote on the walls in doo-doo. Then she blamed everything on one of the other personalities. Then there was Bob, not his real name. I'll give his initials in case anyone from the old country, Seabrook, is listening. His initials were L.H. Bob was a bit off as well. I first met him walking along Highway 146 before I had joined the Border Patrol. He was dressed in a pilot's uniform, and I thought, well, he was. Like maybe his car had broken down, so I stopped and I gave him a ride. You used to do things like that back then. He said that he was working at Ellington Airfield. I dropped him off, and I thought, well, that was my good deed for the day. Later, I discovered that Bob was not all there upstairs. He decided he was going to kill himself by jumping from an overpass. Well, it wouldn't have killed him. It probably would have just broke his leg or two. He also tried jumping off of the local water tower. He tried all kinds of ways of killing himself, and some of them were actually dangerous. He became what is known as a frequent flyer in the ambulance, 2 or 3 times a week. He said one time that he'd been bit by a rattlesnake, but they couldn't find any fang marks anywhere. Another time he drank an entire bottle of poison. Well, it turned out to just be, I think it was vinegar. Uh, every couple of days, the phone would ring and it would be Bob or Bob's friend or Bob's parents. Well, not only was he not all that well upstairs, but he was also sometimes violent. One day, he was screaming and throwing bottles at cars as they went by. Now, the police did try to keep him under control, but it was a small town, and sometimes they would only have one officer working. Bob, throwing bottles around and screaming, wound up stepping on a broken piece of glass and cut his foot pretty badly. Having spent so much time in an ambulance, he had learned a few things about EMS. He got some tape and a splint. Well, the tape was duct tape, and the splint was a 2 foot long 2x4. Wait. First thing to do is to see if you can seal the wound. So he took an entire tube of crazy glue and he smeared it on the bottom of his foot. He then stepped down on the 2x4 and he wrapped his leg from the knee to the toes in duct tape. Looked like a red-green project. When the police finally got there, he tried to run, but that 2x4, well, it just held him in place. The doctor at the hospital left the board glued and taped in place. Every doctor within 100 miles of town knew this guy, and a lot of them were a little tired of treating him. If it wasn't an actual life threatening case, they would refuse to allow him into the hospitals. One day, Bob swallowed 109 pennies, one of those huge rodeo belt buckles, a handful of double edged razor blades, and a few other items. Then he began to complain that his stomach hurt, and so he called for an ambulance. A stomach ache doesn't necessarily get you into the emergency department, at least not back then. He wound up being shipped out to Odessa for treatment. And the funny thing is, rumor has it that the doctor working at the emergency room recognized him. When I was a firefighter, I wanted to be on the hose. That's where the fun, the excitement, and the danger was. Was I crazy? Maybe. A bit. As far as most of my fellow firefighters was concerned, I was insane. If it was as bad as it could get, I was in the heart of it. I used to melt face shields all the time. Maybe that's why today the parts of me that don't hurt are numb. One night we had a call. It was a house fire on Meyer Road. I don't know why I remember the name. It was 4 blocks south of where the fire station used to be. Well, I wound up getting stuck as the driver, which meant I was also going to be stuck as the pump operator. I hated being outside when all the fun and adventure were on the inside, where life could be snuffed out in a second. Okay, maybe I was crazy. As I pulled out of the station and turned onto Main Street, I could see flames up over the top of the trees. I could see them shooting straight up into the sky. They were blue. I immediately told the guy on the passenger seat to call a second, maybe a third alarm. I was thinking maybe we need mutual aid, and I wasn't even close to the fire yet. The flames were about 35 feet in the air above the trees. As we rounded the corner onto Meyer Road, I could see that the building was fully engulfed and fire was going to be on the driver's side of the truck. 95% of the time, it's on the passenger side. It's just one of those things. So the pump operator never sees the fire. All he sees is the pump panel. Well, tonight, that night was my not lucky night. As I opened the door and jumped out of the truck, the heat overwhelmed me. I had to grab my coat, which pump operators never wore their coats. I also had to put on my gloves to work the pump panel. Maybe I shouldn't have parked so close to the fire, but old habits. You always parked right next to the building that was on fire. You never had a fire that was so hot it heated up the pump panel. There was no choice of entering the structure. The flames were coming out every window, doorway, shooting through the roof straight up in the air. It looked like a rocket was trying to fly into the ground. The assistant chief was doing a quick check to see just how bad it was, and he tripped over a wire that was invisible in the darkness. All the light was up, not down. Well, he got up, took a couple steps, and he tripped over another wire and tripped over another one. Every 3 feet, there was a wire coming out of the house at a 45-degree angle, going down to a ground peg. Once the fire had burned itself out, there was no putting it out. All we did was we protected the houses on either side of it. Inside what was left of the house was a bunch of oxygen bottles. You know, the big ones, the M150s, 150 cubic feet of oxygen. There were a few in every room. All along the outside walls were coils of burned copper wire, big piles that had all the insulation burnt off. The coils were lined up with the ground wires that the assistant chief had been tripping over. We found the owner of the house and questions were asked. Why were there so many ground wires? What was up with all those coils of wire, the big ones, and why were there so many O2 bottles in the house? Well, it turns out this guy worked at NASA. He was a genuine rocket scientist. He had built a giant electromagnetic field to keep the space aliens from talking to him. He didn't mind them talking to him telepathically during the day, but at night he wanted to relax. As for the oxygen, well, he would come home and he would flood the interior of his house with pure oxygen to maintain his mind and body. He worked at NASA. He must have known about Apollo 1. Grissom, chaffy white, burned up in a pure oxygen environment because of a spark. This rocket scientist had torched his home, thinking it can't possibly happen to me. Who's the crazy one now? Me or the guy with the oxygen and electricity living in a wood-framed home? I see folks walking up and down the streets that look as if they are communicating with folks that I can't see. Some are having a full conversation. They seem to see or hear things that I can't. Are they crazy or are they tuned in to some other universe? The multiverse theory. Are these multiverse, are they spread out across the universe? Well, it's multi-universes. Are they spread out on a plane or are they stacked up on top of each other? Somebody once described it as soap bubbles, how they form in the sink. Could these people that we consider to be crazy actually be seeing something that is there because they're tuned to a different frequency? Are they really crazy or are they just special? And think about that the next time you see somebody carrying on a one-sided conversation and they don't have a cell phone. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell the people you can't even stand to talk to. They should be listening to Strange Things with Chris James. If you're listening on one of the many platforms that I seem to be on, and you somehow get the impression that I know what I'm talking about, you'd like to hear more of the show, you can find all of the archives at iHeartRadio in the podcast section. If you don't like what I'm saying, why are you still listening? Till next Saturday, this is Chris James. Gonna move the cat so I can see the
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.